Welcome to the Next Pivot Point podcast. This season, I am focused on sharing stories and ideas from global experts on diversity and inclusion. My purpose is to share diverse stories so that you can learn from others' lived experiences and walk away with actionable strategies to lead even more inclusively. I share this information because inclusive leadership is a journey. It requires bravery and courage, and you do not have to do it alone. At Next Pivot Point, I believe we are stronger together as allies. Let's meet this week's guest. Welcome to this week's episode of the Next Pivot Point podcast. I am excited to be joined today by Stacy Gordon, and she's leading at the intersection of diversity, inclusion, and workplace culture. As CEO and Chief Diversity Strategist of Rework Work, Stacy focuses on reworking how companies work, including how they inclusively recruit, hire, and engage employees, effectively creating inclusion and belonging for all. Stacy is the creator of the #1 resume course at LinkedIn Learning, which is well on its way to accumulating 1 million views. Wow. Her unconscious bias course has been translated into several languages and has been featured by LinkedIn, Microsoft, and Virgin America, now Alaska Airlines. As a consultant and career strategist, Stacy has written career and diversity-related articles and provided content for SHRM, Fast Company, Skillsoft, Forbes, NPR Radio, BBC Radio, Essence Magazine, and Monster.com, just to name a few. She's also authored a new book on unconscious bias that will be released this spring. Stacy, I'm so excited to have you.
Thank you. So excited to be here and chat with you and discuss my favorite topic.
Oh, I know. I could talk about this endlessly. In fact, I find myself when we used to have dinner parties, I would talk about this stuff all the time. Right. So I'm excited to dig in because you have a really good, rich expertise and resume and hiring and being inclusively on the front end of that employee experience. So I can't wait to dig into that. Before we get to the nitty-gritty of the conversation, I'd love, Stacy, if you could share what's the backstory? Like, how did you find yourself into the diversity work?
So I actually got into diversity, and it's so funny because I remember I was being interviewed for, it was like Fox Business one time. And I said, you might have noticed that I'm Black and I'm a woman, right? And you realize that in the workplace, you can't avoid these things, right? We see each other, we make assumptions about each other. And so when I worked in recruiting, I was just finding that, I was very naive, right? I was like in this la la land of, we're all going to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. Like I had bought into this American dream where
even though you didn't probably have bootstraps.
Right. But it's like, well, if we all work hard, we will get there. And so I worked hard. I worked really hard. But what I found was when I was recruiting, I was working as an external recruiter, I was having to work extra hard for Black people, for Latino people, for women, for people with accents. And I was like, what is going on here? And I realized that if I didn't do the extra work to get these individuals hired, they weren't going to get hired, or it was going to take them longer to get hired. So that was another week, another 2 weeks, another month of them being unemployed, right? Whereas another recruiter would say, I can't get this person. I'll just go get somebody else who I know the hiring manager will accept so I can get paid. Right.
Right.
And so that's what made me realize, I was like, oh my God, I can't keep perpetuating this recruiting cycle. I have to get out of it. And I have to go to the source. I've got to get to the companies and to those hiring managers and get them to see that what they're doing is not right.
Yeah. And that moment of awareness of, hey, this is really hard for me. I want to be an advocate and get more people of color and women into the workplace. And it's becoming a challenge. I mean, all those kind of little differences that people have from the majority group, and the majority group tends to be the one that does the hiring. These microaggressions that we just kind of apply labels and put somebody as the other, and it affects our thinking and it affects our behavior if we're not careful. So I'm curious, Stacy, knowing you spend a lot of time in the trenches talking with recruiters and talent acquisition folks about how to diversify their recruiting efforts and their hiring efforts, because who doesn't want diverse talent right now? Where do you find the conversation is going? Like, what kind of conversations are you having as you're helping them recruit more inclusively?
I think what's happening is people are starting to realize that they have to do something, but they still don't really know what. And I think that, and I'm biased, right? I think because I used to work as a recruiter, but I think that recruiters get it. They've always kind of gotten it, and they get it before everybody else because they're the ones that have to go out and they're talking to the people, right? Hiring managers might see 3 people, right? But the recruiters are out there talking to hundreds of people all the time. They hear their stories, they see what's happening. So they get it before everybody else. At least in most instances, I'd like to think they do. And so I think that what I'm seeing is that the talent acquisition individuals, those professionals, are the ones that are trying to lead the charge. They're like, okay, if I'm in a company where my leaders won't actually lead, then we'll do it. And so I'm really excited to see that because I've been getting contacted more and more by the talent acquisition departments who are like, look, I don't know what's going on in the rest of the country, but in our department, this is what we want to do.
Yeah, they're doing it for the right reasons. It's coming from a genuine, authentic place, which is always what we want to see. Unfortunately, I think a lot of times it's this swift reaction to what's happening in the news cycle or a customer mandate of, we need to see your diversity numbers, which is becoming a lot more common now.
Right.
And I know for me, when I come into an organization that's operating out of fear or we're behind and we need to catch up. So I'm looking for like this quick fix. And it just happens to be we're going to diversify where we recruit and hire. It's like, oh, I don't know how that behavior is going to show up in the hiring process to signal to others that we really want you here versus we have to get more people like you here. That just feels different to a candidate.
Yeah. And well, I think a lot of it too is some people don't understand the difference, right? Like that's what we work on is helping people understand that difference. Because it's the same action, but it's the intent behind it, right? That makes all the difference in the world. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the hard part is getting people to see that what they're doing. They're like, well, I'm doing this. This is great. This is what you wanted, right? And it's like, yeah, but it's not going to have the impact that you want. It's just empty words and empty actions.
Yeah. Intent versus impact. A lot of our diversity work goes to that. You have to have a good intention. And most people, I think, want to think that they do. And they don't realize the impact of their actions. But every day, little things, microaggressions is a term we use a lot in the diversity world and on this podcast. Little subtle signals that people that don't belong, by the way, that tends to happen a lot more to people of color and to women in the workplace. I'm curious, Stacey, from your vantage point, what are well-intentioned, maybe hiring managers, maybe not always well-intentioned hiring managers, what are the mistakes they're making with microaggressions? What are the things that really aren't inclusive, but people think they're being inclusive?
Well, I think it's just even the very idea that, as long as we get at least, one person of color into the pipeline, that we're doing a good job. And, Harvard Business Review has cited, they've done the studies and shown that that's not the case. It's not until you get at least 2 or 3 women into your pipeline that you're going to actually see impact. And the same with, candidates of color. So there is this pervasive myth kind of going around that, oh, we're doing a good thing. We made sure we included at least one. And it's like, yeah, that's not going to do it. And in most cases, it actually makes it worse because it makes that person stand out even more. And so it makes it even more apparent that they don't belong.
Yeah. And what we need more is like critical mass. I know Dolly Chugg talks a lot about this in her work. And it really resonated with me when I first read this about once you really can't just even have 2 diverse candidates or 2 people on the interview slate that are doing the recruiting that happen to have a diverse background. You really need like 3 or more. And critical mass is kind of like 30% because then that person's not they're not the token diversity, quote unquote, hire or hiring manager. You need that scale. And so many companies are like, well, we don't even have that many people that could hire. It's like, oh, that's a problem too. So I know sometimes we're at like a chicken and egg problem where companies want to be more inclusive. They want to recruit more diverse talent. But like you've outlined, it's a bit of an uphill climb sometimes for them if they're not there yet, meaning they don't really have a lot of diverse talent inside their organization right now. What can they do if they want to recruit more diverse talent, even though they don't really mirror that today?
Well, it goes back to the authenticity, right? It goes back to this having an authentic desire to do it. Because I always think back to a true story. One of the consultants that I work with was helping a company to, diversify their hires. And so they're talking to them about what they need to do, and they send them out to HBCUs, right? Historically Black colleges, universities. And so they go through this whole process and they say, okay, great, we're going to go to the college fair and we're going to hire, diverse candidates, right? So she talks to them afterwards and says, well, how did it work? And they're so excited. And she said, well, great, who did you hire? And she goes, well, we hired, 2 women and a guy. And so she's like, great, what race and ethnicity are they? And they're like, oh, they're white.
I was going to guess that.
I'm like, I'm sorry, wait, what? You went to a historically Black college and university and you managed to come back with 3 white people? Like the statistics on that alone just boggled my mind.
Like, how did that happen? And even
that's what happens when you don't have when you're not paying attention, right, to what it is that you're actually trying to accomplish. And you're still just operating the way that you've always operated. It's like, I always hate to say it, but like that white is right kind of complex. If that's what you've got going on in your head, doesn't matter where we send you. I can send you to, like Kenya, and you're going to come back with a white person because that's just what you're going to be looking for. So unless you are authentically saying, yeah, you know what, we do need to be different. We do need to make a change. We do need diversity and actually want to do it. It's never going to happen.
No, you raise a really good point. If you don't change, you can't just change like where you go to recruit, because I think that's the knee-jerk response too, is HBCUs. We're going to go recruit there. It's like, well, what happens when you show up on campus or now in a Zoom interview? What's your thought process like? So you really, what I'm hearing you say is you really got to check your bias and your intention and rein in your authenticity around why diversity, equity, inclusion is important, how we're defining it as an organization, and what that means when we're actively recruiting and hiring talent. So I'm curious, Stacey, things I hear sometimes, kind of these mistakes to avoid, those microaggressions that sometimes I hear, and this is one of my pet peeves, I'm sure you've heard this one, is, well, we can't lower the standards for diverse talent. What is your response to that when hiring managers say things that are problematic like that?
My actual response to that is my head explodes and I want to punch him in the nose.
Ditto.
And then I remember that I can't do that. And so I literally have to like suck in a breath every time and then go, right, here we go with this again. And so it's just so insulting and it's so frustrating that people don't see how insulting it is to say that. And the ego that has to be on a person to say that, okay, well, every time we've hired, right, and we've happened to hire the white guy must have been the best person for the job. So you're telling me that there was nobody else who was even qualified, no woman, no person of color, no one who came close. Right? Like you realize just how egotistical that is,
right?
And how insulting it is to all of the individuals out there who have worked their butts off and have great skills, great experience, and just aren't seen as qualified. And a perfect example is, oh my gosh, I have to find this. You probably could Google it and find it. There is it was like a mini experiment that got done by 2 individuals who worked together. I wish I could remember the name of the company, but it went viral on Twitter a couple of years ago. And the guy and the girl are working together, and she was always having, like, it was taking her longer to get stuff done. She couldn't figure it out. She was like, why is it taking me so much longer? And the guy was like having a great time. He's like, oh, I get all these sales. It's so great, blah, blah, blah. So they switched emails, right? Like he answered her
Oh,
emails
no.
for a week, and she answered his emails for a week. So they didn't change anything else. It was just, she was answering his emails and vice versa. And she goes, "Oh my God, this was the best work week of my life." She's like, "Nobody questioned me. Everyone just took my advice and did what I instructed them to do, and stuff got done. And it was so great." She's like, "I've never been more productive." And the guy was like, "Oh my God, no wonder you can't get any work done. All these people do is question me. They want backup and this and that, and they want explanations, and they want, all these different things." And he's like, "This was the hardest work week of my life."
Oh my gosh. I would love to do that experiment with somebody and see, because I remember that was my lived experience in corporate America as a white female. I remember my male colleagues would say things and I was like, oh my gosh, like back to your word ego and like brashness of them to just ask for these things. I just thought it was so selfish. Here we are struggling with, our own credibility being questioned about things we're truly experts at and know more than anyone. And that gendered experience is all too common still today, unfortunately.
Yeah. And so that's about the example, though, of like, it is so difficult for people to really see the way that they are biased towards individuals unless they've had it happen to them. So that's why my number one, piece of advice is empathy. Like, we have to teach empathy.
Yeah.
Because when you can teach empathy, then all these other things can fall into place. Without empathy, this stuff doesn't work.
Yeah, well said. Because, especially for white men who are the majority of hiring managers today, what I run up against is they haven't had that lived experience, right? They haven't had their email swapped with a female colleague, or they haven't walked around in black or brown skin for a day and seen it through the eyes of themselves. They really can't, right? But could you empathize, right, with somebody else? Could you understand their story? Could you take on their perspective? Could you truly be curious to learn from others' lived experiences? And that's something that's paramount to the conversation right now. You can learn all the techniques, but getting the right mindset around this, like you're saying, being intentional in how you show up is important. Stacey, I wanted to share, another factoid that a lot of times white people aren't aware of is there's been countless studies done on this. I'm sure you're aware that white names get 50% more callbacks on resumes than black sounding names. And there are no, quote unquote, white versus black names, but traditionally used by white people and by black people. People are always like shocked by that data, right? Like, no, I've had people question me so much on that data, and it's been replicated several times. I'm curious, Stacey, like, how do you get people to believe that? What are your recommendations, and how can we even like overcome that?
A lot of it really is looking at their individual company. So you can take the external data and the things that are happening to other people, and people are always going to say, yeah, but that's them, right? That happened over there. That happened in that company, in that country, in that state, in that town, but that's not us. And so this is why we spend a lot of time going into companies and looking at their own data, because they can't dispute their own data. So the backup is great that it's out there and we need it, but we have to spend the time. That's why we talk about our framework, right? We talk about starting with awareness. Everyone wants to, especially since last year, everyone wanted to jump into action. They want to do something. They want to start a DEI council. They want to hire a CDO. They want to do all these things, right? And I'm like, no, I need you to back up. I need you to back up to some awareness. And I need you to understand what the heck is going on in your own company before you start doing anything, because you don't know who to do it for, what you're doing, why you're doing it. And without that knowledge, nothing can get done, right? Or at least things can get done, but it won't be effective. So it's really important to look at your engagement surveys, to look at the difference in pay equity in your company, to look at the actual numbers of people in your company. I know people don't like to count. They're like, oh, we can't count black and brown. Oh, we can't do that. You have to. In the same way, if you want to actually achieve a goal, you have to know where your starting point is. If you don't measure those numbers up front, how the heck do you know what you're striving for? How are you going to know when you've reached the goal? Right?
Well, you would never do that in any other part of your business. You would never say this is important, but we're not going to measure it. You know, I always joke with organizations like, well, are profits important? How do you measure those? Oh, okay. Even nonprofits, you measure fundraising dollars. So anything that's important, we measure it because to your point, how are you going to know you've gotten better? And so then it leads to this falsehood, this perception of like, oh yeah, we're getting better, right? To your point about like, oh, it's better than it was 5 years ago. And it's like, how do you know that's true? And what measurement are you using to inform that perception? Because chances are it's not that much better. Most organizations, even that have put a line in the sand that are measuring it, they show stagnant at best progress. I'm curious for organizations you've worked with that have achieved their goal of hiring and recruiting more diverse talent. Take us through like maybe an example or a story of like what they did, like what the key things they did on that journey. And I like the word you keep using, intentionally, intentional strategies they took to get from point A to point B.
Yeah, part of it is getting everybody on board, right? So this is where we talk about, go back to the framework. We go from awareness to alignment. The alignment is important because you've got to get all your leaders on board. And they have to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. If they're not helping to push the strategy, not going to happen. So one of the companies that we worked with, that was what we had to do. We had, a meeting with the entire executive team, the heads of all the departments. And we said, here's your goal. You've already, articulated your goal and your strategy. And this is what it looks like. You want to, grow or increase the number of female hires. You want to increase the number of diverse hires by this amount, right? So then part of that, though, where a lot of companies fail is they don't communicate that properly. So they don't communicate that expectation to their employees. And so all that the employees see is that, they are in a space where they are going from, they get this edict, right, being brought down on them like, hey, you need to, hire more Black people, let's say. And it's like, well, why? Right. So with this company, what we got them to do is like, you have to explain, you've got to communicate. You need to talk about why you're doing it. You need to explain what it is that you're doing, what it's going to do for the company, how this helps move, everyone forward. And then once you got everybody on board, then the leaders have to continue driving that home, right? So that's why you've got to get into your KPIs. You've got to look at your metrics. And so they actually created a dashboard where they were checking this every month and they were reporting it out. And every quarter they had a town hall where they were talking about it. And so the recruiters knew what they needed to do. And the recruiters had a scorecard. And so everyone is working together to this shared goal. So, and then you even had pushback from some people who are like, well, why are we doing this? Well, we're doing this because we already did the measurement and we've already discovered that we don't have, enough women in tech. We could be better. So, and that's where we get to this external number where people want to say, well, how are we supposed to get to, I'm just making up a number, but 20% women in tech when we're only at 3%. Well, first of all, just try to get to at least for your industry, right? Like, what does your industry look like? We're not trying, creating arbitrary goals just based upon the population of women in the world, right, is not going to do it. We need to look at what's achievable, right?
So, yeah, I like when people are organizations like, we're going to be at 50% women in leadership by like next year. Right. Like, oh boy.
Right. It's like based upon what? And everyone likes to say, well, there aren't enough women, using women in tech as an example. There aren't enough women who graduate in tech. Okay, fine. I get that. Right. But are you even meeting the percentage of women who graduate in tech? So if only 15% graduate, do you at least have 15% in your company? No. So we're not trying to get you past what's happening in, the graduation rate. We're just trying to get you to what's actually achievable, and you're failing there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So use the right baselines. Like I like industry comps. In most industries, you can get comps. You can do some peer-to-peer sharing with other folks in your industry. Look at graduation data. It's really compelling, I think, too, even when you look at fields where, using women as an example, where women have made progress over the last 10, 20 years, law and medicine. Graduation rates are higher from law schools and from medical schools. Unfortunately, though, if you look at the top of those organizations, partners at law firms and managing partners inside medical practices, they're still very, very male dominated and white male dominated. So even when we get people in the front door, we're not seeing them elevate to the highest ranks of an organization. And, I think what you're raising here is, why is that, right? Maybe we're not doing everything we need to be doing. Maybe we're not signaling the right things. Maybe we're not really being intentional with it. Because so much of this, I know over the course of the last year, we've certainly experienced a wild ride in the diversity space, but so many organizations in the wake of George Floyd, came to me. I'm sure they came to you. It's like, okay, we just need to hire diverse talent. Like, that's our number one thing right now. And it feels, I think, like an easy thing to do. Like, we're just going to bring these diverse groups in, and they're just going to miraculously stay and be engaged in a very white male stale environment. And that's just not the case. So I wonder, Stacey, like, how do we prevent this from being like one of our pet peeves, a hot topic in the workplace? How do we sustain something like hiring inclusively?
I think in order to sustain, hiring inclusively, we have to get to a place where, we are really thinking about that as the goal, right? So it's not about just bringing people in the door. It is about retaining them. So then it means we have to think about how to retain. And I have to go back even to, the whole question about, not wanting to lower the bar. Because not only does that frustrate the crap out of me, but it is the pervasive thought that people have. And I think until we can do something about that, that all the other things are not going to be able to be possible, right? You can't recruit inclusively and bring individuals in and welcome them in and keep them in a place where they actually feel like they belong, when what you're thinking is, this person got in here because they're Black, because they're a woman, and they're not actually as qualified. And so nothing that they do in your eyes is going to be as good, right? They're never going to rise to that level that you think they should be at. So there's absolutely nothing that can happen until you've changed that perspective.
Because you'll be looking for evidence to support, to confirm what you already think, confirmation.
Right. And even without looking for the evidence, there's just always that thought in your head. I mean, we have another company that we worked with that, they promoted 2 women to their board, right? They had all men. And they said, okay, well, we need to promote women. So they promote these 2 women, but what do? They created new roles that had no power. So they basically signaled to the entire company that we have just tokenized these 2 women because we've just put them on this board. We've given them absolutely zero power to do anything other than sit here and look pretty.
Right. It's the worst. Please don't do that. Right. Because then it just reinforces the stereotype that women somehow aren't as qualified. Or
exactly.
Aren't going to do the hard work.
Both of those women left within months after that. They were like, this is ridiculous, right? So then it reinforces that stereotype, because then it's like, oh, they couldn't cut it at the board level, so they left. It's like, no, they were tired of being looked at as though they didn't belong, and that they didn't actually, have the merit and the gravitas to do the job. And they were like, we're not going to stay in a place where I'm going to be treated like that.
Yeah. I can take my talent elsewhere where people actually listen to me and take me seriously. People can feel that. You can feel how you're being perceived. And it was something that always bothered me in really white male settings in my corporate career, is like never being taken seriously. Like the bar was so low, and how surprised people would get when you performed. It's like, well, what? Like, I did my job. It shouldn't be miraculous, but it's that bias that people have because they just haven't seen it enough. We haven't seen women, we haven't seen people of color succeed as much at that high level as white men.
And that goes back to your, question about microaggressions, right? Because it makes me think about one of the ones that comes up a lot, especially for Black women or for Black people in general, is, oh, you're so articulate. And then people can't understand why that is an insult. It's an insult because you have the thought that I wouldn't be articulate. And so you were so shocked when I am articulate that you can't help but let those words leap out of your mouth.
Yeah, I remember.
Which signals to me that you didn't expect me to be articulate, and it is an insult.
Yeah, it is. And I remember having an experience where I didn't understand that. This was early on in my ally journey. So forgive me, listeners. But candidly speaking, I mean, it was quite some time ago. I remember telling a woman of color, like, how impressed I was with her presentation and how articulate she was. And I used that exact word. And I thought I was giving her a compliment. And she just looked horrified at me. And then I checked in with myself later and I thought, you know what? Think about how many women of color you've seen present before. Like how few I had seen even present in corporate America. This was like a big formal presentation and she just rocked it. And I have to say, I could count those people on one hand. Whereas white males, I had seen like hundreds of times present and not great.
And the thing is, though, how many white women would you have gone up to and said, "You're so articulate," right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I mean, it's like all the white women listening right now, please raise your hand if somebody has ever said to you, "You're so articulate."
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. It's absolutely a intersectional that speaks to the intersectionality of especially race and gender. Women of color get that way more often than white women, and certainly more than white men. So, great example, Stacy. I wonder, kind of in wrapping up, I wanted to share one of the other pet peeves that really get you fired up as well. I think one of the faux pas people make in the hiring process and this biased language, these microaggressions that show up. One of my personal faves is, well, we hire the best talent here. The best person for the job is absolutely who we hire. So how do you dismantle that one? Like, what's when someone says something like that, like, how do you help shape their thinking that maybe we're not doing the best job?
Yeah, I mean, it goes back to what I said earlier, right? It's like, do you realize how egotistical you have to be to actually say that out loud and mean it? Because you're basically discounting every other person who even applied for the job. So you're trying to tell me that of all the people that applied for the job, you might have interviewed 5 or 6, that this person was the absolute best, right? I mean, how many mediocre people do you have working in your companies right now? How many people could you look at and go, I wish I could fire you right now, right? And how many of those people are white?
Right.
So there are so many mediocre people who have gotten into jobs because they know somebody, because they went to the same school as somebody.
Oh, that's a huge one. They went to the school. They've got
went to the same fraternity, right? They got the same degree that I did. We both golf at the same club, right?
Yep.
I mean, these are the things, these are what get people hired. And then you want to turn around and say, oh, but they were the best person for the job? Really? By what standard?
That's good. I think that's a really good response. Like, how do you know? What standards are you using? And that's why using something like competency-based hiring, having questions that are more skill-based assessment, objective questions. And I personally like kind of the scenario-based questions of like, actually, when you're doing the job, what are the 5 to 6 things that might come up in a day? And having someone just kind of think through how they would objectively handle that can sometimes even the playing field. I think, to your point about this myth of meritocracy, that everyone's just got an equal chance. Not really. And how do you make sure your hiring process is super objective so that you catch that and you sniff out the bias and you make sure your hiring managers are truly being intentional with inclusion? Stacy, this is so good. Thanks for unpacking all this today. I'm walking away, I know, with some great strategies and certainly some good stories to share with my clients. So I know our listeners, this is a real treat for us. Tell our listeners, how can they follow your work and engage further with what you do?
Well, we've got a couple different ways. Definitely, you can always find me on LinkedIn. LinkedIn is where I probably connect with most individuals, and it's pretty easy to find me. It's linkedin.com. What is it? /in/Stacy Gordon. So easy to find me. My website is reworkwork.com, and that's reworkwork.com. You can remember it because we rework what doesn't work about work.
I love it.
And, I have the book coming out, so obviously I would love it if you would purchase. It's called Unbiased, Addressing Unconscious Bias at Work. And you can find it on Amazon. You can find it on Barnes & Noble, Bookshop, Wiley.com. And so, we just, a lot of different, I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and all of that too.
Oh, good. Well, we'll be sure to link to those in the show notes. And thank you so much for being with us today, Stacy.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate you listening to this episode. If you like this podcast, the best way you can be an ally is to write a review on iTunes, on Spotify, on Google, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Every review helps other allies find us. I host this podcast because I believe we are stronger together as allies.